The Keth Dominion had never lost a war. In 300 years of expansion, they had crossed the stars and taken what they wanted. They had burned the cities of the Orvath. They had broken the fleets of the Selen. They had watched 47 civilizations bend their knees and accept the chains of Dominion rule. Every species they had ever met had done one of two things when the Keth came. They had fought and lost, or they had surrendered and lived a little longer. There was no third option. There had never been a third option. Fleet Prime Vale Keth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Judgment, and looked out at the stars ahead. He was tall even by Keth standards, with gray-green skin that had grown pale with age, and 4 black eyes that missed nothing. He had served in the Dominion fleet for 60 years. He had led 43 successful subjugation campaigns. He had never once doubted the outcome of a battle before it began. He did not doubt now. Behind him stretched 3,000 warships. They filled the void of space like a moving city, engines burning cold blue fire, weapon systems powered and ready. It was the first subjugation armada, the greatest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled for a single campaign. Most thought it was too much. The Council had debated for months about whether such a large force was even necessary for a target as weak as humanity. Vale Keth had asked for every ship anyway. Not because he was afraid. He was never afraid. He had asked because he believed in doing things properly. Humanity was young, barely 200 years out from their homeworld, and scattered across only a handful of star systems. Their ships were small and slow compared to Dominion vessels. Their weapons were simple. Their politics were a mess of competing nations and alliances that seemed to change every few decades. By every measure the Keth scouts had taken, humanity was a primitive and divided species that had not yet learned what the galaxy truly was. What the galaxy truly was Keth territory. The scouts had been watching humanity for 60 years. Quiet probes, passive observation, long-distance stands. The data was thorough. Humanity had no unified military command. They had no experience fighting a war among the stars. They argued constantly among themselves about resources, borders, and politics. They were, in the words of the scout report that had been presented to the Council, a species in the process of tearing itself apart before any outside force needed to bother. The Council had laughed at that line. Vale Keth had not laughed. He never laughed at enemy assessments. He had seen too many campaigns go wrong because someone in command had assumed the fight would be easy. He had asked for 3,000 ships, and he had spent months planning every phase of the campaign. Humanity would be given one chance to surrender. If they refused, and they would refuse, because young species always refuse the first time, the fleet would move to Earth and begin the process of subjugation from the top down. The human governments would fall within weeks. The people would follow. It was a clean plan, a good plan. The fleet crossed into the outer edges of the Sol system on a quiet morning by Keth Standard Time. The gas giant Jupiter was visible ahead, a swirling brown-orange mass that grew slowly larger on the view screens. Vale Keth watched it without expression. He had seen bigger planets. He had seen more impressive systems. Sol was an unremarkable star with an unremarkable collection of worlds orbiting it. The third planet, Earth, was blue and green and covered in water, which the humans needed to survive, and which the Dominion had no use for. They would leave the planet itself mostly intact. Damaged worlds were harder to administer. He gave the order to send the transmission. The Keth communication officer broadcast it on every frequency humanity used, in 17 of their most common languages, translated carefully and precisely. The message was short. The Dominion always kept its demands short, because long messages suggested uncertainty. The message said, "You have been found. You have been judged. Surrender your governments, your fleets, and your worlds to the authority of the Keth Dominion within 48 hours, or we will take them from your corpses." Vale Keth waited for the screaming to start. The humans always screamed first, Every species screamed first. Broadcasts of panic and outrage, and desperate calls for help that would never come. Then came the negotiations, the offers of tribute, the failed attempts to buy time. Then the fighting, which was always brief. Then the quiet. 48 hours passed. There was no response from Earth. No panicked broadcasts. No calls for negotiation. No military chatter on the frequencies his officers monitored. The humans knew the fleet was there. They had the technology to detect it at this range. They were simply not responding. Vale-Keth found that mildly unusual, but not concerning. Some species responded to fear with silence, rather than noise. It changed nothing. He ordered the fleet to begin its advance toward the inner system. That was when the sensor officer made a sound that Vale-Keth had never heard from a bridge officer in 60 years of service. It was not a word. It was not a report. It was something small and involuntary, a sharp intake of breath followed by complete silence, as if the officer had suddenly forgotten how to speak. Vale-Keth turned from the view screen. "Report," he said. The sensor officer's hands were moving over his panel, pulling up the readings again and again, as if he expected them to change. His skin had gone pale. His 4 eyes were very wide. "Fleet Prime," he said slowly. "There is something near Jupiter." "Define something." The officer looked up. In 60 years, Vale-Keth had never seen a Keth officer look uncertain on a bridge. They were trained out of uncertainty. Uncertainty cost lives. "It is large, sir," the officer said. "It was not there when we entered the system. It was not in any of the scout reports. It was not on any scan we took during the approach. It appears to have been hiding in the storm bands of the gas giant. It has just moved." Vale-Keth walked to the sensor panel himself and looked at the readings. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up at Jupiter on the view screen, and he watched the shape that was moving out of the planet's shadow, slow and enormous and patient, like something that had been sleeping for a very long time and had only just decided to wake up. It was not a ship, or rather, it was a ship, but the word felt wrong applied to something of that size. Ships were vessels, they were tools. What was rising out of Jupiter's storms was something else. It was 2 kilometers long. Its hull was dark gray and scarred with old damage, burns and impact craters, and the marks of weapons that had struck it and failed to stop it. It moved with a slow, absolute certainty, as if it had nowhere to be, and nothing to fear, and all the time in the universe. On 3,000 Keth view screens, the shape resolved from blur to detail. Vale-Keth heard the silence spread across his bridge like a wave. He had never seen anything like it. In 300 years, the Dominion had never encountered anything like it. It should not exist. No young species should be capable of building something like this. The engineering alone would require decades of focused effort, resources on a massive scale, and a level of coordination that the scout reports said humanity could not manage. But it was there. It was real, and it had been waiting for them. Vale-Keth stood very still on his bridge, and for the first time in 60 years of war, he did not know what to say. 30 years before the Keth fleet ever entered the Sol system, a woman named Dr. Amara Osei stood in a freezing cold room deep inside the Titan research station and told a room full of generals and politicians the most important thing anyone had said in human history. She said, "We are being watched." The room had gone very quiet, not the quiet of disbelief, the quiet of a group of people hearing something they had suspected for years and had hoped was not true. Dr. Osei was the head of the Deep Space Anomaly Project, a small and underfunded team that had spent 8 years studying a series of strange signals detected at the very edge of the solar system. The signals were faint, easy to dismiss as noise. But noise did not repeat itself in precise mathematical patterns at regular intervals, and noise did not shift position in ways that suggested something deliberately staying out of detection range. Something was out there. Something was watching. The meeting lasted 11 hours. When it ended, The politicians went home and said nothing publicly, because saying something publicly would cause panic. But behind closed doors, the governments of Earth did something they had never done before in their long and complicated history. They agreed on something. They agreed that they needed to build. The project had no public name. In classified files, it was called Operation Longbow, but the people who worked on it, the engineers, the physicists, the weapons designers, the AI specialists, they called it simply the shipyard. It was hidden in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter at first, then later moved into the upper layers of Jupiter's atmosphere, where the gas giant storms provided perfect cover from any sensor that was not directly inside the planet. For 30 years, the shipyard built one thing: the UEFS Prometheus. Admiral Yeva Strauss had been given command of the Prometheus 4 years before the Keth arrived. She was 53 years old, with short gray hair and dark eyes that had the look of someone who had spent decades making decisions that cost people their lives, and had learned to carry that weight without being destroyed by it. She had served in 3 of humanity's smaller interstellar conflicts, had commanded destroyers and cruisers, and eventually a battle group, and had been chosen for this command specifically because she was, as the selection committee report put it, the kind of person who does not panic. They had not been wrong about that. Strauss had spent 4 years learning the Prometheus the way a person learns a second language, slowly at first, then all at once, until it became something close to instinct. The ship was unlike anything else humanity had built. It was 2 kilometers from bow to stern. Its hull was made of compressed matter armor, a material so dense that standard weapons fire would take hours to cut through it. It carried 12 plasma lance arrays capable of firing in any direction simultaneously. It had point defense systems that could track and destroy incoming fire at ranges most ships could not even detect targets. It had a complement of 240 fighter craft stored in internal bays. And at the center of everything, running through the ship's systems like a nervous system through a body, was Minerva. Minerva was not a simple computer. The engineers who had built her liked to say she was the collected memory of every battle humanity had ever fought, compressed into something that could think. She had been trained on 60,000 years of human warfare, from the earliest recorded conflicts to the most recent skirmishes at the edge of colonized space. She could process sensor data faster than any human mind, and run thousands of combat scenarios in the time it took a person to blink. But she was also something more than a calculator. She had been designed to work with human commanders, not replace them, and after 4 years of working with Admiral Strauss, she had learned something that pure logic could never have predicted: that a human being in the middle of a fight was capable of decisions that no model could anticipate. She found that interesting. She found humans generally interesting, in the same way that a scientist finds an experiment interesting, with genuine curiosity and a certain careful respect for the unpredictability of the results. When the Keth fleet entered the Sol system, Strauss was in her command chair on the bridge of the Prometheus, watching the sensor feeds with the same calm expression she wore for everything. The ship had been sitting in Jupiter's upper storm bands for 8 months, waiting. The Keth probe from 60 years ago had told humanity when to expect company. Not the exact date, but close enough. Humanity had had decades to prepare the welcome. Around the Prometheus, the welcome was taking shape. 47 stealth frigates had been sitting silent and dark in the space between Jupiter and the inner planets for 6 months, running on minimal power, invisible to Keth sensors. 300 automated weapons platforms were positioned throughout the Keth fleet's approach vector, disguised as debris and rock. Minefields, seeded with devices that were completely undetectable until they activated, had been laid across every practical route from the outer system to Earth. And hidden in the data clouds of Jupiter's magnetosphere were relay stations that connected every piece of it to Minerva's control systems. The Keth had not entered the Sol system. They had walked into a box. "Fleet Prime has sent his demand," the communications officer reported. His voice was steady. Everyone on the bridge of the Prometheus was steady. Strauss had spent 4 years making sure of that. Standard subjugation protocol. 48-hour deadline. Strauss said nothing for a moment. She was reading the fleet composition data Minerva had assembled from passive sensor sweeps. 3,000 ships. It was more than the models had predicted. She took a slow breath and noted the number, and then set it aside, because the number was not the most important thing. The most important thing was what they did next. No response, she said. Let them wait. Minerva's voice came from the speakers above the command chair, quiet and precise. The silence will concern them more than any message we could send. It suggests either total collapse or total confidence. Given their intelligence on human psychology, they will not be certain which. Good, Strauss said. The 48 hours passed slowly. The crew moved through their stations with quiet efficiency. Strauss slept 4 hours, ate twice, ran 2 full tactical drills with department heads, and reviewed the engagement plan with Minerva 3 more times, not because she had forgotten it, but because repetition was how you turned a plan into something your hands knew without being told. When the deadline expired and the Keth fleet began to move, Strauss stood up from her command chair and straightened her uniform jacket. "Bring us up," she said. The Prometheus rose out of Jupiter's shadow. It was a slow rise, deliberate and unhurried, the way a very large and very confident thing moves when it has no reason to rush. The storm clouds of the gas giant fell away below the hull. The vast gray shape of the ship climbed into open space, and on 3,000 Keth view screens across the Dominion Armada, a shape appeared that none of them had ever seen before. Strauss opened a channel. Her voice went out across every Keth frequency in the Dominion's own language, learned from 60 years of studying their probe's data, calm and clear and completely without fear. "Fleet Prime," she said, "you should have studied us more carefully." Then she looked at Minerva's feed and saw what the Keth sensors were seeing, and for just a moment, very briefly, she allowed herself a small and quiet satisfaction. They had seen the ship. They had gone still. "Minerva," she said, "begin the second transmission." "Already prepared, Admiral," Minerva said. "Shall I tell them what they are standing in?" Strauss sat back down in her command chair and looked at the 3,000 ships spread across her screens. "Tell them everything," she said. The Keth had a word for it. Velnarath. It meant, roughly translated, the stillness before the predator strikes. It was an old word, older than the Dominion itself, older than their cities and their fleets and their 300 years of conquest. It came from the deep past, from before the Keth had become the hunters, when they were still prey animals on a world that wanted to kill them. It described a very specific biological experience, the complete and total freezing of every voluntary muscle in the body, when the brain recognized, on some level below conscious thought, that it was looking at something it could not fight. The Keth had not felt it for a very long time. They felt it now. It did not happen all at once. It came in stages, the way cold water rises, slowly and then all at once, and by the time you noticed it, you were already in it, up to your neck. First came the size. The sensor reports had called the object large, but numbers on a screen do not prepare you for the reality of something 2 kilometers long, moving through space toward you. The Prometheus was not the biggest thing in the Sol system. Jupiter dwarfed it to near invisibility. But the gas giant was a natural object, a mindless mass of gas, following the laws of physics. The Prometheus was different. It was built. Every line of it was deliberate. Every surface had a purpose. The scale of it carried a meaning that raw size alone could not. It told anyone looking at it that the beings who had made it had meant to make it that big, and had had the ability to do so. No young species should have had that ability. Then came the scars. A bridge officer on one of the Keth destroyer squadrons was the first to say it out loud, though many others were thinking it at the same moment. He stared at his magnified feed of the Prometheus's hull, and said very quietly, "It has been in battle before." He was right. The hull bore the marks of it clearly. There were long gouges in the compressed matter armor where weapons had struck and dragged across the surface. There were darker patches where extreme heat had scorched the hull and the metal had cooled into a different texture. There were impact craters, not small ones, but craters that spoke of weapons fire from vessels comparable in size to Keth heavy cruisers, and every single one of them was old, healed over, repaired, or simply endured. Something had tried to destroy the Prometheus, more than once, and it had failed. The question that no one on any of the 3,000 Keth ships wanted to ask out loud was the obvious one. What had tried? Then came the message. Minerva had done her work with the Keth communication codes carefully. 60 years of studying the probe's data had given humanity a thorough understanding of Dominion military protocols, not just the language, but the structure of command, the hierarchy of authority, the specific codes that a Fleet Prime's own AI would use to transmit tactical data. When Minerva broadcast on those frequencies, in those codes, it did not sound like a message from an enemy. It sounded, in the deep, instinctive part of every Keth officer's brain, like orders from command. The message said, "Fleet Prime, you have entered a kill box. You have been in a kill box since you crossed the heliopause. This engagement is already over. The question is whether you survive it." On the bridge of the Eternal Judgment, Keth heard it. He did not move. He had been standing very still since the Prometheus had risen from Jupiter's shadow, and he continued to stand very still now, which was deeply unusual for a man who had spent 60 years commanding fleets. He was aware of his officers watching him. He was aware that they were waiting for him to speak, to give an order, to do something that would break the terrible quiet that had fallen across the bridge. He was aware of all of this, and he did not act on any of it, because his mind was doing something it had never done before in 60 years of war. It was refusing to produce a plan. This was not cowardice. Keth was not a coward. He had stood on this bridge while enemy fire tore through his ship's hull, and had given orders without his voice shaking. He had fought campaigns where his losses mounted to levels that would have broken lesser commanders, and he had kept going, kept planning, kept finding the angle that led to victory. He was not afraid of death. He was not afraid of loss. He was afraid, for the first time in his life, that he had made a mistake he could not fix. Then the sensor data came in. Minerva had been generous with the information. As she spoke of kill boxes and heliopauses, her systems were simultaneously transmitting sensor data on every Keth-accessible frequency. Data that the Dominion fleet's own sensors could verify. Data that was therefore impossible to dismiss as a bluff. Keth watched his tactical officers process it in real time. Watched their faces as the numbers came in. And he knew from those faces that the message had not been an exaggeration. The stealth frigates decloaked. Not all at once. In groups of 3 and 4, scattered across the entire approach vector, they appeared on Keth sensors like ghosts becoming solid. 47 of them. Small ships by the standards of the Eternal Judgment, but fast and heavily armed, and positioned at every angle that a retreating fleet might try to use. They had been there the entire time. The Keth fleet had passed right through them on the way in, and had detected nothing. Then the weapons platforms activated. 300 of them, spread through the debris fields and the emptiness between planets, powering up one by one, target locks lighting up on every Keth tactical screen, like a rash spreading across the body of the fleet. Each platform was small, unmanned, automated, controlled by Minerva's systems, but each one was positioned with surgical precision, and together they formed a net that covered every direction the Armada might move. Then came the worst part. Minerva transmitted the minefield maps. Thousands of undetectable devices seeded through every practical route from the outer system to Earth, through every gap in the platform coverage, through every lane a desperate retreat might try to take. She showed them where every mine was, and in doing so made something absolutely clear. She was not afraid of them knowing. The mines were not a threat she needed to hide. They were a fact she was presenting. The bridge of the eternal judgment was completely silent. Every officer sat or stood at their station and looked at their screens and said nothing. Vale-Keth could hear very faintly the hum of the ship's systems. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear, if he concentrated, the sound of 60 years of certainty falling apart. He thought about the scout report, the one that had said humanity was tearing itself apart, the one the Council had laughed at. He thought about the probe they had sent 60 years ago, the one that had returned with data suggesting a species barely capable of leaving their own atmosphere. He thought about every assessment, every projection, every confident briefing that had laid out the weakness of this species and the ease of their subjugation. He thought they knew. They had known for 60 years. They had found the probe, they had studied it and understood what it meant, and then they had sat very quietly and built and built and built, while the Dominion looked at their assessments and saw prey. Vale-Keth looked at the Prometheus on his view screen. It had not fired. It was not advancing. It was simply sitting in space, with its weapons powered and its hull scarred, and its sensors no doubt examining every ship in his fleet with the same calm thoroughness that it had examined everything else. It was waiting. And Vale-Keth stood in the middle of his bridge, surrounded by 3,000 ships and 60 years of victories, and he felt the Vel Narath settle into his bones like ice water. He felt for the first time in his long and decorated life. Vale-Keth gave the order to attack. He gave it not because he believed they could win. He was too experienced a commander to lie to himself about the situation. He gave it because he could not retreat. Not in front of 3,000 ships. Not in front of every officer and crew member in the first subjugation armada. The Keth did not retreat from young species. The Keth did not retreat at all. If word went back to the Dominion that a fleet prime had turned away from a single human ship, no matter what that ship was, the damage would be worse than a defeat. It would be a wound to the Dominion's idea of itself that might never heal. So he gave the order to attack, and the battle began. The first wave was 300 Keth heavy cruisers, the fastest ships in the armada, accelerating toward the Prometheus in a tight formation designed to concentrate fire on a single point of the human ship's hull. It was the standard opening move against a larger target. Concentrate, overwhelm, break through. Minerva watched them come. She had been running engagement models for 4 years. She had run this specific scenario, 300 heavy cruisers in tight formation, closing on the Prometheus, 11,000 times. She knew exactly what they were going to do, and exactly when they were going to do it, not because she could predict the future, but because the Keth were very good and very experienced soldiers, who fought according to principles that worked, and therefore did not change them. Minerva respected that. It made them predictable. She fired the plasma lances at targets the Keth ships had not yet reached. This was the thing about plasma lances. They traveled at a fraction of the speed of light, which meant that at combat ranges you did not fire at where a ship was. You fired at where it was going to be. A human gunner could not make that calculation fast enough to matter. Minerva could make it for all 12 arrays simultaneously, for every target in range, updating the calculations every fraction of a second as ships changed course and speed. The first volley hit 43 Keth cruisers at the exact same moment. Not disabled, not damaged, destroyed. The plasma lance arrays were not weapons designed for warning shots. They were designed to end ships, and they did, and the formations behind the first wave had to scatter to avoid the debris of their own lead elements, and the tight approach became something ragged and chaotic that Minerva had also modeled and was already accounting for. On the bridge of the Prometheus, Admiral Strauss watched the tactical display and said nothing. There was nothing to say yet. This was Minerva's fight in these opening moments, the pure calculation phase, where human instinct would only slow things down. Strauss knew this, and she let Minerva work, watching the display with the same calm expression she wore for everything, looking for the moment when the fight would stop being a math problem and start being something else. The stealth frigates opened fire. 47 ships, positioned across the entire width of the Keth fleet's approach, firing from angles that the cruiser formation had left completely open. The Keth were experienced soldiers, and they adapted fast. Within minutes, the Armada's rear elements were turning to engage the frigates, splitting their attention and their fire. This was exactly what Strauss had planned. The frigates were not supposed to win their engagements. They were supposed to create chaos. Chaos was something humans were very good at using. The weapons platforms joined the fight. The chaos deepened. And then the Keth did something Minerva had rated at 11% probability. Something that surprised her, which was rare, and that she would think about afterward for a long time. The Fleet Prime pulled his heaviest ships forward. Not the cruisers, not the destroyers, but the Keth dreadnoughts, 8 of them, each one nearly as large as the Prometheus itself, pushing through the middle of the engagement toward the human ship with a directness that was almost contemptuous. He was trying to kill the Prometheus. If the Prometheus died, the battle might still turn. The platforms were automated. The frigates were small, and a Keth fleet of 3,000 ships, even a damaged and disorganized one, could outlast 47 frigates and 300 platforms through sheer numbers. The Prometheus was the center of everything. Destroy the center, and the rest might collapse. It was not a bad plan. It was a very good plan. Strauss saw it developing on her tactical display, and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of danger that good commanders felt when an enemy did something smart. "Minerva," she said. "I see them," Minerva said. "Recommend we do not allow all 8 to engage us simultaneously." "Agreed. Take us forward." There was a pause of approximately 1/4 of a second, which was, for Minerva, a very long time. "Admiral," she said, "moving forward will place us in the direct fire lanes of approximately 800 Keth warships." "I know," Strauss said. "Do it anyway." The Prometheus accelerated. What followed was the part of the battle that would later be studied in military academies on both sides of the conflict, analyzed and argued over, and still not fully understood decades later. The Prometheus moved into the heart of the Keth fleet, and the Keth fleet tried to kill it, and could not. The armor held. The point defense systems worked so fast and so well that incoming fire was destroyed before it reached the hull, more than half the time. The plasma lances fired continuously, and each shot was placed by Minerva with a precision that felt almost surgical, threading between Allied frigates, accounting for the movement of every ship in the engagement simultaneously, never wasting a shot. But it was not clean. It was never clean. Human ships burned. 3 frigates were destroyed in the first 20 minutes, cut apart by Keth fire from multiple directions that even Minerva's coordination could not fully protect against. A weapons platform took a lucky hit from a Keth destroyer and detonated, taking 2 nearby platforms with it. The Prometheus herself took hits. The dreadnoughts had gotten 3 of their number within close range before Strauss and Minerva had managed to break up the formation. And the close-range fire from Keth dreadnoughts was the most powerful weapons fire in the galaxy. The compressed matter armor held, but it held the way a dam holds floodwater, by degrees, by endurance, by not breaking, even when everything around it was bending. The crew of the Prometheus fought their ship the way humans had always fought, with everything they had. The damage control teams moved through the corridors at a run. The medical teams worked in the bays without stopping. The weapons crews loaded and fired and loaded again. The engineers pushed power to wherever it was needed most. Minerva coordinated all of it, but she coordinated it the way a conductor coordinates an ensemble. The skill was in knowing which instruments to bring in and when, and the music was made by 12,000 individual human beings, deciding every second not to stop. 6 hours after Vale Keth gave the order to attack, the battle was over. Of 3,000 Keth ships, fewer than 200 remained. They were scattered, damaged, and retreating in multiple directions. No longer a fleet, but a collection of individual ships trying to find a way out of the minefields, with the help of Minerva's transmitted maps, because she had given them the maps, and was still transmitting them, because she had been instructed to give the survivors a way to leave. Strauss had given that instruction before the battle started. Not out of mercy, though there was some of that. Out of understanding. Survivors went home. Survivors told stories, and the story these survivors would tell was exactly the story that needed to be told. The Eternal Judgment drifted in the debris field of its own fleet, engines down, hull breached in 3 places, running on emergency power. Many of his bridge crew were not. He sat in the wreckage of his command chair and stared at the view screen, which was cracked but still functional, and watched the Prometheus stop firing. Then Minerva's voice came through his ship's systems one final time, quiet and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. We remember every species that tried to end us. We remember their names. We remember what they built. We even remember why they came. Fleet Prime Veilketh, you will be permitted to leave. We suggest you use that time well. Veilketh sat in the quiet of his broken ship and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The journey back to Dominion space took 41 days. Veilketh spent most of it alone. The Eternal Judgment limped through the dark between stars, with 3 of her 4 engines running below capacity, and a hull that groaned sometimes in a way that made the remaining engineering crew nervous. 187 ships had made it out of the Sol system. Some of them had taken heavy damage. Some of them had lost significant portions of their crew. All of them were quiet in a way that Keth military vessels were not supposed to be quiet. Not the disciplined quiet of professionalism, but the other kind. The kind that comes when a group of people have seen something that has changed the way they understand the universe. Veilketh wrote his report on the 3rd day. He wrote it the way he had done everything in 60 years of service, thoroughly, honestly, and without softening the parts that reflected badly on him. The Keth military tradition had little patience for commanders who dressed up their failures. Failures were information. Information was how you did not make the same mistake twice. He described the trap in precise detail. He described the Prometheus. He described Minerva's communications, the stealth frigates, the weapons platforms, the minefields. He described the battle with the same clinical precision he would have used to describe a successful campaign, noting what the humans had done well and what the Keth had done wrong. He described the moment when the Vel Narath had taken him, because that too was information, and because he was not ashamed of it. Any rational being would have felt it in that moment. The shame would have been in pretending otherwise. He saved the last section of the report for last, because it was the worst part, and he wanted to be careful with the words. On the 41st day, the broken remnant of the first subjugation armada crossed back into Dominion space and began the slow journey to the capital. Word had preceded them somehow. Word always traveled faster than ships, and Veilketh could tell from the silence of the communication channels that the Dominion already knew something had gone wrong. The normal traffic of a busy interstellar civilization had gone very quiet on the military bands. People were waiting. He let them wait. The council chamber was the oldest room in the Dominion. It had been built when the Keth first reached the stars, before any of the conquests, before the Empire existed. The walls were lined with the names of every species the Dominion had subjugated, carved in the fine script of the Keth ceremonial language. The council members themselves were very old, even by Keth standards, beings who had lived long enough to see the Dominion grow from a single system to a civilization that spanned 100 worlds. They had not sat in this chamber and heard the word defeat for 300 years. Veilketh stood before them and told them everything. He told them about the trap. He told them about the ship. He told them about the battle and the losses and Minerva's final message. He told them about the Vel Narath, not apologizing for it, but explaining it, because he needed them to understand exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. He had seen species that fought hard. He had never seen a species that had spent 60 years setting a trap for an enemy that had not yet arrived, and had shown that enemy the trap while it was closing around them, because it was that confident in the result. When he finished, the council was silent for a very long time. The eldest counselor, a being so old that her skin had gone from gray-green to almost white, looked at Vale Keth with 4 eyes that had seen 3 centuries of Dominion history, and she said, "How long have they known we were coming?" Vale Keth reached into his uniform jacket and took out the data chip. He set it on the table in front of him. "This was recovered from a human frigate during the battle," he said. "It contains Dominion intelligence files. Specifically, it contains files about our scout probe, the one we sent to observe them 60 years ago. Analysis protocols, reverse engineering notes, tracking data. The humans found it within 3 months of its arrival in their system. They kept it. They studied it for years. They used it to learn our language, our communication codes, our military protocols, our sensor frequencies." He paused to let that settle. "They then reseeded it with false data about their own capabilities and returned it to its original observation position. Every piece of information we collected about humanity in 60 years of observation came from a source that humanity had been controlling for nearly the entire period." The chamber was completely silent. "The data on their internal divisions," Vale Keth continued, "their weak military command structure, their technological limitations, all of it was given to us deliberately. They wanted us to think they were vulnerable. They wanted us to come. They spent 60 years building the weapon that would meet us when we arrived. And they spent 60 years making sure we would not know it existed until it was too late to change the plan." The eldest counselor's eyes had not moved from his face. "The ship," she said, "the Prometheus. Is it the only one?" This was the last part, the part he had saved, the part he had been careful with the words for. Vale Keth looked at the council, at these ancient beings with their centuries of certainty, and he felt something that was not quite pity and not quite respect, and was something in between the two. "No," he said. "Intelligence recovered from the frigate included partial construction data from 6 human shipyard facilities spread across their colonized systems. The data is incomplete. The humans were careful about what was on that ship. But what we have is sufficient to establish that at least 4 more vessels of comparable scale to the Prometheus are currently under construction, at varying stages of completion." He let the silence hold for a moment. "The Prometheus is their oldest. It is the ship they built first, 60 years ago, when they found our probe and understood what it meant. The others are newer. They incorporate improvements. Our engineers, after reviewing the partial schematics, believe the newer vessels may significantly exceed the Prometheus in weapons capacity." The eldest counselor said nothing. None of the council members said anything. They sat in the oldest room in the Dominion, surrounded by the names of every species that had bent its knee to their authority, and they were very still. Vale Keth thought about the Vel Narath. He thought about how it had felt to be standing on his bridge, watching that ship rise from Jupiter's shadow, and how the stillness had taken him not because he was weak, but because some part of him, the old deep animal part that lived in every thinking creature, had recognized with total clarity what he was looking at. He thought the council was feeling something very similar right now. "There is one more thing," he said. "The human admiral, at the end of the battle, after the outcome was not in question, she could have destroyed the remaining ships, all of them. She chose not to. She gave us the minefield maps. She let us leave." He paused. Minerva's final transmission said they remembered. Every species, every name, every reason. He folded his hands in front of him. "I believe they let us go home so that we would tell this story, so that you would hear it, so that the Dominion would understand, before anything else happened, exactly what it had found." The chamber was quiet for a very long time. Then the eldest counselor looked down at the data chip on the table, and she looked back up at Vale-Keth, and she said something that no one in that room had expected to hear in that place, surrounded by 300 years of conquest. She said, "We need to send an envoy." And in the silence that followed, not a single voice disagreed. Outside the chamber, on 100 Dominion worlds, life went on as normal. Ships moved between stars. Citizens went about their days. The great machine of the Keth Empire turned as it always had turned, patient and massive and sure of itself. But in the oldest room in the Dominion, something had shifted. A certainty had cracked. An idea that had been the foundation of 300 years of history. The idea that the Keth were the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, had met something in the dark of a human star system, and had come back changed. They had gone looking for prey. They had found